The Indian National Movement, 1857 to 1917. Chapter 1. The First War of Independence, 1857. Introduction. The process of the British conquest of India and the consolidation of British rule was accompanied by resentment amongst the Indians. Hardly a year passed till 1857 when some part of the country or the other did not rise in revolt against the British domination of India. However, these rebellions were local, scattered and isolated. They did not pose a serious challenge to the British. Nonetheless, these revolts establish a local tradition of struggle against the foreign rule. The culmination of such opposition to British rule came with the First War of Independence in 1857, in which millions of peasants, artisans and soldiers participated. It shook the British government to its very foundation. Let's learn more about it. Causes of the First War of Independence. The first 100 years of British in India, that is, from 1757 to 1857, were marked by the British conquests and rapid expansion of their dominion in India. The combined effect of British expansionist policies, economic exploitation, and administrative changes adversely affected all segments of Indian society. The ruling classes were dispossessed of their power, the peasantry was deprived of its land rights, and the artisans lost their livelihood. The middle and upper classes of Indian society, particularly in northern India, were annoyed because of their exclusion from the well-paid higher posts in the administration. Men who followed cultural or religious activities, like priests and scholars, found themselves without income as they lost their patrons. And who were these patrons? Well, the Indian rulers, princes and zamindars who had themselves lost their authority. The company's Indian soldiers were discontent with their low pay, hard life and the ill treatment meted out to them by the British officers. Thus, by 1857, conditions were ripe for a mass uprising, and the accumulated grievances of the people burst forth in the form of the First War of Independence. In this chapter, we shall study about following causes: political causes, socio-religious causes, economic causes, military causes. Political causes. The political reasons which antagonized the Indian rulers were the following. 1. Policy of expansion. The British policy of control and gradual extinction of the native Indian states was one of the major grievances of the Indian rulers. Ever since the Battle of Plassey in June 1757, the East India Company's territorial power increased rapidly. The British tried to expand their political power in India 4 ways. That is, by outright wars, by the system of subsidiary alliance, by adopting the doctrine of lapse, and on the pretext of alleged misrule. A. By outright wars. To expand their territorial power in India and to safeguard their economic and political interests, the British waged many wars. The Battle of Buxar in 1764 established the British as masters of Bengal, Bihar and Odisha. As a result of their success in Anglo-Mysore Wars 1767 to 1799, the East India Company annexed most of the territories of the Mysore state. After the Third Anglo-Maratha War 1817 to 1818, the Peshwa's entire dominions and all Maratha territory north and south of the Narmada River were acquired by the British. The Punjab was annexed in 1849 after the Sikhs were defeated in the Second Anglo-Sikh War. From 1823 to 1856, the British further extended their empire by conquering Sindh, territories of Assam, Arakan and Tenasserim and Pegu in Myanmar. B. The subsidiary alliance. Some Indian states were brought under the British control without actually annexing them. This was done by following the subsidiary alliance introduced by Lord Wellesley. Under this system, the Indian rulers who agreed to the subsidiary alliance A. accepted the British as the supreme power, B. surrendered their foreign relations to the East India Company and agreed that they would not enter into any alliance with any other power and would not wage wars, C. accepted a British resident at their headquarters and agreed not to employ any European in their service without consulting the company, D. agreed to maintain British troops at their own cost, and E. virtually lost their independence. By 1856, practically all the Indian states had either been annexed or had entered into alliances with the company. The British had become the supreme power and the Indian princes were reduced to puppets. C. By using the doctrine of lapse. Lord Dalhousie, the Governor-General of India, annexed many Indian states to the company using the doctrine of lapse. Now, according to this doctrine, heirs adopted without the consent of the company could inherit only the private property of the deceased ruler and not his territory, which would come under the company's rule. When the ruler of Jhansi died in 1853, leaving no natural heir, the widowed Rani was pensioned, and the adopted son, Anand Rao, was not recognized as a lawful successor to the throne. The other prominent states which became victims to the doctrine were Satara, Jaithpur, Sambalpur, Udaipur, and Nagpur. The principle of lapse was also applied to take away the titles and pensions of the rulers of some states. Regal titles of the Nawabs of Karnataka and Tanjore were taken away. This caused discontent among the rulers as well as among the people in general. The rulers of Indian states believed that their states were annexed not by the application of doctrine of lapse, but due to the lapse of all morals on the part of the British. What do you feel? D. On the pretext of alleged misrule. In 1856, Lord Dalhousie annexed Awadh to the company's dominions on the pretext of alleged misuse. The annexation of Awadh was arbitrary as the British seemed to have broken their promises made to the ruling chiefs. This caused resentment among the Indians in general and Awadh in particular. Lord Dalhousie justified the annexation of Awadh on the pretext of the good of the governed, but the people of Awadh, on the contrary, had to face more hardships. They had to pay higher land revenue and additional taxes on food, houses, ferries, and justice. The dissolution of the Nawab of Awadh's army and administration threw thousands of nobles, officials, and soldiers out of jobs. The British confiscated the estates of the talukdars or zamindars. The dispossessed talukdars became the opponents of the British rule. The company's sepoys, of whom 75,000 were from Awadh, were the worst affected. These soldiers had helped the British to conquer the rest of India. But they did not like that their homelands should come under the foreign sway. The annexation of Awadh also affected the soldiers' financial position. They had to pay higher taxes on the land their families held in Awadh. In fact, Awadh played a major role in the uprising of 1857. Disrespect shown to Bahadur Shah. Bahadur Shah Zafar, the Mughal ruler, was under the protection of the company and received a pension from the British. In 1849, Lord Dalhousie announced that successors of Bahadur Shah Zafar would not be permitted to use the Red Fort as their palace. They were required to shift to a place near the Qutub Minar. In 1856, Lord Canning announced that after the death of Bahadur Shah, his successors would not be allowed to use the imperial titles with their names and would be known as mere princes. Now, this decision of the British hurt the feelings of the Muslims. Consequently, Zeenat Mahal, the wife of Bahadur Shah, began plotting against them. 3. Treatment given to Nana Sahib and Rani Lakshmi Bai. Nana Sahib was the adopted son of Baji Rao II, the last Peshwa. The British refused to grant Nana Sahib the pension they were paying to Baji Rao II. Nana Sahib was forced to live at Kanpur, far away from his family seat at Pune. This was widely resented at the Maratha region. Nana Sahib had inherited wealth from the former Peshwa, which he utilized in sending emissaries to different parts of the country for generating awareness among the Indians about the British policies. Nana Sahib travelled between Delhi and Lucknow to gather support for the movement. Rani Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi, who became the victim of the doctrine of lapse, became a bitter enemy of the British as her adopted son was not accepted as the heir to the throne. The other Indian rulers who were not adversely affected became suspicious lest they should meet the same fate. 4. Absentee sovereignty of the British. Absentee sovereignty means that India was being ruled by the British government from England at a distance of thousands of miles. Absentee sovereignty of the British rule was resented by the Indians. The earlier rulers, like the Mughals, who had conquered India, had in course of time settled in India. The revenues they collected from the Indians were spent in India only. But here, in the case of Britain, the Indians felt that they were being ruled from England and India's wealth was being drained to England and not utilized for their welfare. Socio-religious causes. The British government's attempt to interfere in the social and religious life of the Indians led to the widespread fear among the masses. 1. Interference with social customs. Some of the social reforms introduced by the British in India were aimed at improving the conditions of the people. However, while introducing such reforms, the feelings of the people were not taken into consideration. The result was that the reforms, like the abolition of sati in 1829, the introduction of the Widow Remarriage Act in 1856, and the opening of Western education to girls, were not welcomed by the masses. 2. Apprehensions about modern innovations. The introduction of modern innovations, such as railways and telegraphs, was misunderstood by the people. There were rumors that the telegraph poles were erected to hang people who were against the British rule. Similarly, the Orthodox Indians noted that in the railway compartments, the higher castes and the lower castes were made to sit side by side. They believed that the British had introduced such practices to defy their caste and religion. 3. Policy of racial discrimination. The British officers were rude and arrogant towards the Indians. They believed that they were superior to Indians and followed a policy of contempt towards the Indians. They dubbed the Muslims as cruel and unfaithful. Some European officers ill-treated and insulted Indians. Such acts of unjust discrimination alienated the British from the Indian masses. 4. Corruption in administration. The police and petty officials were corrupt. The rich got away with crime, but the common man was looted, oppressed, and tortured. 5. Oppression of the poor. The complex judicial system enabled the rich to oppress the poor. Flogging, torture, and imprisonment of cultivators for their inability to pay arrears of rent, land revenue, and interest on debt were quite common. Thus, the growing poverty made the poor desperate and led them to join a general uprising in the hope of improving their lot. 6. Activities of missionaries. The British were different from Indians in race, religion, and sentiments. In the 18th century, the British showed a friendly attitude towards Indian religions. They had no particular zeal for their own religion, and the company even acted as trustee of some Hindu temples. However, in the 19th century, This attitude underwent a change. The British began to interfere with the local religious and social customs. They denounced idol worship and dubbed local beliefs as ignorance. After 1813, there was an increase both in the numbers and activities of the Christian missionaries. 7. Fears regarding Western education. The Western system of education was introduced in a number of schools. In 1829, the Bengal government established an English class in the Calcutta Madarsa, which was a Muslim institution. Later, English classes were introduced in Banaras Sanskrit College. The shifting of emphasis from Oriental learning to Western education was not received well by the people, especially the Pandits and the Maulvis. They saw in it an attempt to discourage traditional Islamic and Hindu studies. People started suspecting that the aim of Western education was not to promote literature and sciences, but to encourage their children to become Christians. 8. Taxing religious places. Religious sentiments of the Indians were hurt by the official policy of taxing lands belonging to temples and mosques. Such lands had been exempted from taxation by previous Indian rulers. The families dependent on these lands began to propagate that the British were trying to undermine the religions of India. 9. Laws of property. The Religious Disabilities Act of 1850 changed the Hindu law of property. It enabled a convert from Hinduism to other religions to inherit the property of his father. The Hindus regarded this as an incentive to give up one's religious faith. Economic causes. The most important reason for the popular discontent was the economic exploitation by the British. The economic exploitation took the following forms. 1. Exploitation of economic resources. Agricultural India was made an economic colony to serve the interests of industrial England. India was forced to export at cheaper rates raw materials like raw cotton and raw silk that the British industries needed urgently. Plantation products like indigo and tea and food grains, which were in short supply in Britain. India was made to accept ready-made British goods either duty-free or at nominal duty rates, while Indian products were subjected to high import duties in England. The Indian handmade goods were unable to compete with the cheaper machine-made British products. This ruined the Indian industry, deprived the artisans of their income, and reduced the avenues of employment for labour. On the other hand, export of raw materials and food grains deprived India of her agricultural surplus and raised the prices of raw materials. Thus, the change in the nature of India's trade became an instrument for exploiting India's resources. Drain of wealth. Till the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the European traders used to bring gold into India to buy Indian cotton and silk. However, after the conquest of Bengal, the British stopped getting gold into India. They began to purchase raw material for their industries in England from the surplus revenues of Bengal and profits from duty-free inland trade. Thus began the process of plundering India's raw materials, resources, and wealth by Britain. The transfer of wealth from India to England, for which India got no proportionate economic return, is called the drain of wealth. The drain includes the salaries, incomes, and savings of Englishmen, the British expenditure in India on the purchase of military goods, office establishment, interest on debts, unnecessary expenditure on the army, etc. 3. Decay of cottage industries and handicrafts. Heavy duties on Indian silk and cotton textiles in Britain destroyed Indian industries. On the other hand, British goods were imported into India at a nominal duty. By the middle of the 19th century, export of cotton and silk goods from India practically ceased. The art of spinning and weaving, which for ages had given employment to thousands of artisans, became extinct. The misery of the artisans was further compounded by the disappearance of their traditional patrons and buyers, the princes, chieftains, and zamindars. 4. Economic decline of peasantry. The peasants were discontent with the official land revenue policy and the consequent loss of their land. In fact, it was the peasantry that bore the heavy burden of taxes to provide money for the trade of the company, for the cost of administration, and the wars of British expansion in India. For example, in Bengal, the land revenue was double the amount collected under the Mughals. Not even a part of this revenue was spent on the development of agriculture or on the welfare of the cultivator. Increase in the land revenue forced many peasants into indebtedness or into selling their lands. The traditional zamindars were replaced by merchants and money lenders. These new landowners had no concern for the peasants. They pushed rents to exorbitant levels and evicted their tenants in case of non-payment. The economic decline of the peasants affected cultivation and led to many famines. 5. Growing unemployment. The traditional rulers had given financial support to scholars, preachers, and men of arts. The coming of the British led to a decline of such rulers, and gradually their patronage came to an end. Thus, all those who depended on their patronage were impoverished. When the native states were annexed to the British Dominion, thousands of soldiers and officials in administrative, military, and judicial posts became unemployed because British policies excluded Indians from high posts. All these people became bitter enemies of the British rule in India. 6. Inhuman treatment of indigo cultivators. Indigo trade was highly profitable to the British, but the conditions under which the peasants had to work were inhuman. The peasants were forced to cultivate only indigo in the fields chosen by the British planters. If they planted anything else, their crops were destroyed and their cattle were carried off as punishment. 7. Poverty and famines. British economic exploitation, decay of indigenous industries, high taxation, the drain of wealth, stagnation of agriculture, and exploitation of the poor peasants reduced the Indians to extreme poverty. Famines ravaged the country in the second half of the 19th century. There were 12 major and numerous minor famines between 1765 and 1857. The famines were the result of drought, other natural calamities, as well as bad administration. The British government did nothing to lessen people's misery. 8. Decline of landed aristocracy. The landed aristocracy, which included the talukdars and the hereditary landlords, were deprived of their estates. According to the provisions of the Inam Commission in 1852, 20,000 estates were confiscated when the landlords failed to produce evidence, like title deeds, by which they held the land. These confiscated lands were sold by public auction to the highest bidders. Such estates were usually purchased by merchants and money lenders who did not understand the needs of the tenants and exploited them. This drove the landed aristocracy to poverty without benefiting the peasantry, which suffered under the weight of exorbitant land revenue. Military causes. Several factors contributed to the change in the attitude of the Indian soldiers towards the company. These included the following. 1. Ill treatment of Indian soldiers. The East India Company established the British Empire in India with the help of Indian soldiers. Despite the fact that Indian soldiers were as efficient as their British counterparts, they were poorly paid, ill-fed, and badly housed. British military authorities forbade the sepoys from wearing caste or sectarian marks, beards, or turbans, and they showed disregard for the sentiments of the sepoys. 2. General Service Enlistment Act. According to traditional belief, it was taboo for a Brahmin to cross the seas. The British Parliament passed the General Service Enlistment Act in 1856. As per this act, Indian soldiers could be sent overseas on duty. So, this act did not take into account the sentiment of the Indian soldiers. The Brahmin soldiers saw in this a danger to their caste. This led to a feeling of resentment among them. 3. Larger proportion of Indians in the British Army. The number of British troops in India was never very large, with the British in the ratio as low as 1 in 4,000. Dalhousie had recommended that more British soldiers should be recruited in the army. This could not come through. Thus, it made it easier for the large number of Indian soldiers to take up arms against the British. 4. Bleak prospects of promotions. All higher positions in employment were reserved for the British, irrespective of their performance. Even the Indian soldiers formerly occupying high positions in the armies of native princes could not rise above the rank of a subedar. The future of the Indian soldiers was bleak, without chances of promotions. 5. Deprivation of allowances. The extension of British dominion in India adversely affected the service conditions of the sepoys. They were required to serve in areas away from their homes without extra payment, and additional bhatta, that is, foreign service allowance. The Post Office Act of 1854 withdrew the privilege of free postage enjoyed by sepoys. 6. Faulty distribution of troops. Places of strategic importance like Delhi and Allahabad had no British armies and were wholly held by the Indian soldiers. Besides, England was engaged in several wars outside India. Example, the Persian, that is the Iranian War, the Crimean War, and the Chinese War. Indian soldiers had the feeling that the British were in difficulty and the safety of her Indian empire depended on them. They were therefore determined to strike at them at a suitable time. 7. Poor performance of British troops. The British Army suffered major reverses in the First Afghan War, 1838-42, in the Punjab Wars, 1845-49, and in the Crimean War, 1853-56. In 1855-56, the Santhal tribesmen of Bihar and Bengal, armed with axes and bows, rose up against the British, temporarily sweeping away the British rule from their area. Now, though the British suppressed the Santhal uprisings, the disasters they suffered broke the myth that the British were invincible. It further revealed to the Indian soldiers that the British army could be defeated by the determined Indian army. 8. Lower salaries. The wages of the Indian soldiers were inadequate to support their families. On the other hand, the British soldiers received more than 8 times the salary of the Indian soldiers. 8. Cause. Introduction of the Enfield rifle. In 1856, the British authorities decided to replace the old-fashioned musket called the Brown Bess by the new Enfield rifle. The loading process of the Enfield rifle involved bringing the cartridge to the mouth and biting off the top greased paper with the teeth. So what was the problem? Well, in January 1857, there was a rumor in the Bengal regiments that the greased cartridge had the fat of cow or pig. The sepoys were now convinced that the introduction of greased cartridges was a deliberate move to defile Hindu and Muslim religions, as the cow is sacred to Hindus and the pig is a taboo to Muslims. So both the Hindus and the Muslim soldiers refused to use these cartridges and staged an uprising when they were forced to use them. Beginning of the uprising. On February 26, 1857, the 19th Native Infantry at Berhampur in Bengal refused to accept the cartridges given to them. The regiment was disbanded as a warning to other regiments. The sepoys feared loss of their caste and religion if they accepted the greased cartridges. As a result, Mangal Pandey, a sepoy, led an attack on the adjutant of the 34th Native Infantry at Barakpur on March 29, 1857. Mangal Pandey was executed after a court-martial. For his fellow sepoys, he became a martyr. Main events. 1. Events at Meerut. News of the events in Bengal spread like wildfire. On May 9th, 85 sepoys refused to touch the cartridges on the parade ground. They were sentenced to 10 years of rigorous imprisonment. On May 10th, all the sepoys at Meerut rushed to the jail and set free their comrades and other convicts. 2. Events at Delhi. The soldiers from Meerut came to Delhi the next morning. They were joined by the local infantry. They seized the city and proclaimed the aged Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah the Emperor of India. He was coerced to write letters to all chiefs and rulers of India, urging them to organize a confederacy of Indian states to fight against the British regime. In the process, the British lost Delhi. Sir John Nicholson surrounded Delhi and after 4 months of attack, captured Delhi. The old Emperor Bahadur Shah was found guilty of aiding the movement. As a punishment, his 2 sons were shot dead in front of him. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and deported to Yangon in Myanmar, where he died in 1862. 3. Events at Lucknow. Begum Hazrat Mahal, the wife of the Nawab of Awadh, led the uprising at Lucknow on May 30th, 1857. The city was recaptured by the British in March 1858. Begum Hazrat Mahal fled towards the Nepal frontier. 4. Events at Kanpur. Nana Sahib led the struggle for independence at Kanpur. The British surrendered in June 1857. A large number of English men, women and children were captured by an infuriated mob. The British defeated Nana Sahib in December 1857. Nana Sahib fled towards Nepal. His general, Tatya Tope, escaped to Kalpi. 5. Events in central India, Jhansi and Gwalior. The battle began at Jhansi early in June 1857. Sir Hugh Rose laid siege to the fortress of Jhansi in March 1858. Rani Lakshmi Bai resisted, but Jhansi was captured by the British when traitors opened the gates of the fortress for them. The Rani escaped from the fortress on the night of April 4, 1858, to join Tatya Tope at Kalpi. The Rani died fighting the British on June 17, 1858 at Gwalior. Tatya Tope was betrayed by the Gwalior chief Man Singh and was hanged on April 18, 1859. 6. Other centres. At Bareilly, Khan Bahadur, a descendant of the former ruler of Rohilkhand, took command of the movement. In Bihar, the struggle was led by Kunwar Singh, the zamindar of Jagdishpur. He had been deprived of his estates by the British. At Faizabad, the leadership was taken by Maulvi Ahmadullah, who aroused the Muslim community against the British rule. Bengal, Rohilkhand, Bundelkhand, Central India, several parts of Bihar and East Punjab rose against the British policies. In several states in India, the rulers remained loyal to the British government, but their soldiers rose against the British. In most of these places, common people rose up in arms and fought with their axes and spears, bows and arrows. Chronology of events. February 26, 1857. Unrest among the soldiers at Behrampur, Bengal. March 29, 1857. Resentment by Mangal Pandey at Barakpur. May 9th, 1857. Resentment by 85 sepoys of the 3rd Cavalry at Meerut. May 10th, 1857. The sepoys at Meerut broke out openly against the British and headed towards Delhi. May 11th to 30th, 1857. Outbreaks in Delhi, Firozpur, Bombay, Bareilly, Aligarh, Etawah, Bulandshahr, Lucknow. The Mughal Emperor proclaimed as the Emperor of India. June 1857. Uprising at Gwalior, Bharatpur, Jhansi, Allahabad, Faizabad. August 1857. Uprising at Indore, Mhow, Saugar, Jhelum, Sialkot, etc. September 1857. Recapture of Delhi by the English. November 1857. Defeat of the British at Kanpur. December 1857. Victory of the British at Kanpur. Escape of Tatya Tope. March 1858. Recapture of Lucknow by the British. April 1858. Victory of the British at Jhansi. Uprising in Bihar by Kunwar Singh. June 17, 1858. Death of Rani of Jhansi. July to December 1858. Re-establishment of British authority in India. April 1859. Tatya Tope captured and hanged to death. Consequences of the First War of Independence. Now, even though the uprising of 1857 was suppressed, it shook the British rule in India to its very foundation. It brought about far-reaching effects on Indian socio-political life. Let's study the consequences of the First War of Independence in detail, one by one. 1. End of the company's rule. The most significant result of the uprising of 1857 was the end of the rule of the East India Company and assumption of the Government of India directly by the Crown. This was done by the Government of India Act of 1858, which had the following provisions. First, it transferred the power to govern India from the East India Company to the British Crown. Second, while the authority over India was earlier in the hands of the directors of the company and the Board of Control, now the power was to be exercised by the Secretary of State for India, aided by a council. The Secretary of State was a member of the British Cabinet and was responsible to the Parliament. Thus, the ultimate power over India remained with the British Parliament. Third, the Secretary of State was to be assisted by a 15-member Indian Council. 7 of them were to be elected by the Court of Directors, and rest of the 8 members were to be appointed by the Crown. Of these, more than half of the members were to be persons who had served or resided in India for at least 10 years. Fourth, Secretary of State's salary and allowances were to be paid out of the revenues of India. Fifth, actual governance was to be carried on, as before, by the Governor-General, who was also given the title of Viceroy or Crown's personal representative. Lord Canning was the first Viceroy under this Act. Sixth, appointments to the civil service were to be made by open competition under rules made by the Secretary of State. 2. Queen Victoria's Proclamation. The Queen's Proclamation incorporating the transfer of governance from East India Company to the British Crown was made public at Allahabad on 1st November 1858, by Lord Canning, the first Viceroy of India. The proclamation promised that the Government of India would, first, follow a policy of non-intervention in social and religious matters of Indians. Second, treat all subjects, Indians and Europeans, as equals. Education and ability would be the basis of all appointments. Third, grant a general pardon to all those who had taken part in the war, except those who were found guilty of murder of British subjects. Fourth, do its best to advance the industries in India. And fifth, promote works of public utility in India so as to ensure the material as well as the moral progress of the people. 3. End of Mughals and Peshwas. With the death of Bahadur Shah II, who was deported to Yangon, the Mughal dynasty came to an end. Nana Sahib, the last Peshwa, had taken an active part in the uprising and had fled to Nepal after the failure of the uprising. So, the office of the Peshwa also came to an end. Thus ended two of the most formidable foes of the British, the Marathas and the Mughals. 4. Relations with princely states. The policy of annexation and the doctrine of lapse were abandoned. Some of the Indian princes had remained loyal to the British and had helped them in suppressing the uprising. Their loyalty was rewarded with the announcement that their right to adopt heirs would be respected and the integrity of their territories guaranteed against future annexation. In 1876, Queen Victoria assumed the title of the Empress of India. The Indian princes willingly became junior partners or agents of the British Crown because they were promised that they would continue as rulers of their states. 5. Policy of divide and rule. After 1858, the British continued their policy of divide and rule by turning the princes against the people, province against province, caste against caste, group against group, and above all, Hindus against Muslims. They alienated the people from their rulers by giving them special protections and concessions. The government cleverly used the attractions of government service to create a split along religious lines among the educated Indians. The British also encouraged hatred and ill feeling among the Hindus and the Muslims so that they could never challenge the British Empire in India. 6. Racial antagonism. The British believed in their racial superiority and they thought that a social distance was to be maintained to preserve their authority over the Indians. Railway compartments, parks, hotels, clubs, etc., reserved for Europeans only, were visible manifestations of this racialism. 7. Foreign policy. India's foreign policy was dictated by the interests of the British government. It fulfilled the two aims of the British: A. Protection of its Indian empire, and B. Expansion of British economic and commercial interests in Asia and Africa. The cost of implementation of these policies was borne by who else? The Indians. For instance, India under the British had to wage wars with her neighbours like Nepal and Burma, which is Myanmar, in which Indian soldiers had to shed their blood and the Indian taxpayers had to meet the heavy cost of the war. 8. Increased racial bitterness. After the uprising of 1857, racial bitterness increased. The British dubbed all Indians as unworthy of trust and subjected them to insults and humiliation. In fact, the entire structure of the Indian government was remodeled and based on the idea of a superior race. 9. Religious changes. The British rulers declared emphatically their policy of non-interference in the religious affairs, customs, and traditions of the Indians. 10. Changes in the army. The Indian army was reorganized after 1858 to prevent the reoccurrence of another uprising in the following manner. First, the strength of European troops in India was increased. The ratio of European to Indian troops was fixed at 1:2, Bengal Army, and 2:5, Madras and Bombay armies. Practically the same ratio was maintained till the First World War. The general principle adopted was that the number of Indian sepoys should not exceed twice that of the European troops. Second, European troops were kept in key geographical and military positions. Third, the earlier policy of excluding Indians from the officer corps was strictly maintained. Fourth, to desist the Indian soldiers from rising again against the British rule, the sophisticated weapons and ammunition were never placed under the charge of Indians. All Indian artillery units, with the exception of a few mountain units, were disbanded. Fifth, discrimination on the basis of caste, region, and religion was practiced in the recruitment to the army. The organization of the Indian section of the army was based on the policy of balance and counterpoise, or divide and rule, so as to prevent another anti-British uprising. Sixth, in order to discourage nationalism, measures such as introduction of caste and community in most regiments were taken. Seventh, newspapers, journals, and nationalist publications were prevented from reaching the soldiers to keep the Indian army separated from the life of the rest of the population. 11. Economic exploitation. The uprising of 1857 ended the era of territorial expansion and ushered in the era of economic exploitation in the following manner. First, India was turned into a typical economy, exporting raw material, importing finished goods. Second, the salary and allowances of the Secretary of State and members of the India Council, the civil servants, and military officers were a large drain on the country's resources. Third, peasants were impoverished under the British rule. The indigo peasants of Bihar revolted on a large scale in 1866 to 68. Fourth, rural artisan industries such as handicrafts, spinning, and weaving collapsed. Fifth, the Indians had to pay heavy interests and dividends on the British capital invested in India. The British invested their surplus capital in India in railways, plantations, coal mines, jute mills, shipping, etc. 12. Rise of nationalism. The uprising of 1857 was the first struggle of the Indian people for freedom from British imperialism. It paved the way for the rise of the national movement. The sacrifices made by revolutionaries like Rani Lakshmi Bai, Nana Sahib, and Mangal Pandey served as a source of inspiration for the future freedom fighters. The heroic struggle also established valuable traditions of resistance to the British rule. 13. Widening of the gulf between Hindus and Muslims. During the First War of Independence, both the Hindus and the Muslims showed great enthusiasm and zeal to fight against the alien government. But after the uprising, the gulf between the two communities widened. This was the consequence of the British policy of divide and rule, by which they sowed the seeds of dissension between the two communities. It was a deliberate attempt so that the two communities might never come together to pose a threat to the British rule in India. Drawbacks of the First War of Independence. The following were the drawbacks of the First War of Independence. First, the movement did not have common plans of military action or a centralized leadership. The uprisings in different parts of the country were completely uncoordinated. Second, the movement had no common goal before it except for the anti-foreign sentiments. Third, the East India Company had the services of men of exceptional abilities like Lawrence, Nicholson, Havelock, Outram, Campbell, etc. They fought the toughest battles in the initial stages of the uprising and controlled the situation till reinforcements were received from abroad. Fourth, the British Empire had far superior resources in terms of men, money, and materials to the Indians. Fifth, the movement did not have nationwide dimensions. It could not spread much to South India and most of Eastern or Western India. Sindh and Rajasthan remained quiet. Nepal helped in the suppression of the movement. Bombay and Madras armies remained loyal to the British. Sixth, some of the rulers of the Indian states and the big zamindars refused to join the movement. Seventh, some sections of the Indian society were hostile to the uprising. For example, the money-lenders and the big merchants of Mumbai, Kolkata and Chennai, whose main profits came from economic connections with the British merchants. Besides, some zamindars of Bengal were loyal to the British. Some sections of the educated Indians did not support the cause as they had the wrong notion that the British rulers would help them accomplish the task of modernization, while those opposing the British government would take the country backward. Eighth, the uprising was supposed to begin on May 31st, 1857. But due to the greased cartridges incident, it began much before the fixed date. Remained disorganized. Nature of the war. Historians and scholars have different views about the nature of the outbreak of 1857. Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, in his book The Indian War of Independence, described it as a planned war of national independence. Noted historian S.N. Sen also believes that the uprising of 1857 was a war of independence. What do you think? Well, according to him, the uprising began as a fight for religion and ended as a war of independence, as the revolutionaries wanted to get rid of the alien government and restore the old order of which the King of Delhi was the rightful representative. Whatever be the nature of the uprising of 1857, it is generally hailed as the first war of independence because, first, it was the first mass uprising in which all the sections of Indian society participated against a common enemy, that is, the British. Second, it paved the way for the rise of modern national movement. The sacrifices made by Lakshmi Bai, Nana Sahib and Mangal Pandey served as a source of inspiration to the leaders and people to fight for the independence of India from the British rule.